Greetings to everyone joining us tonight for our second event of the year. We have more events to come and hope you'll continue to join us as we host guest speakers presenting on a range of topics covering the history of class struggle in Virginia and beyond. Our goal as the Virginia worker is to build a distinctly pro-worker and independent ideological pole of attraction for the Virginia working class, which we recognize does not otherwise exist. Our editorial board is composed of groups across the state who emphasize organizing workers independently from capitalist parties and their auxiliary organizations, which promote a class collaborationist agenda. Our website is meant to popularize the struggles, campaigns, reports, and debate across the state. We welcome all contributions that fall in line with our mission statement, which you can find at thevirginiaworker.com. On to tonight's host or presenter, we have Chris Townsend. He is a 44-year trade union organizer and leader. He was a 25-year staff member for the left-wing United Electrical Workers Union, UE, spending 20 years as the political director and Washington representative. After retiring from UE in 2013, he spent 8 years as international union organizing and field director for the Amalgamated Transit Union, ATU, and retired from ATU in early 2022. He was also an organizer and SALT for locals of SEIU and UFCW in the 1980s. Townsend is the jack of all trades in the trade union world, having handled just about any assignment imaginable over his career. Politically, he began as a member of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, DSOC, the predecessor of DSA, in 1977, and was a member and leader in the Communist Party, CPUSA, from 1979 until 1991. Chris joined the Labor Party Advocates, the LPA, in 1990 and became one of the national leaders of the Labor Party when UE affiliated as a second union to do so in 1996. He was a continuous Labor Party trustee and organizer, authored his Capitol Hill Shop Steward column in the Labor Party Press until the dissolution of the party in the latter 2000s. He writes frequently for the Marxist-Leninism Today website and has been leading the revival of William Z. Foster in his works. Chris lives in Alexandria, Virginia, and I'll pass it off to Chris here. Just want to go over again one more time. Chris is going to present on his involvement with the Labor Party for tonight's event. And once he's done with that, we'll open it up to a Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box and we'll read them off as they come along. So without further ado, I'll pass it off here to Chris.
Cool. Thanks very much, brother and comrade, and hello to everybody from Alexandria up here. And it's always nice when you get to write your own introduction, but that is me. Been at this a long time, labor and political work as well. And I've lived here in Virginia since 1992. So what's that, 31 years. UE sent me down here to run their Washington, D.C. office. So I lived over here because it was less traffic back then. So anyway, the Labor Party, this question came up in some of my discussion with Adam about, how things have gone over the years. I can't see everybody, but I probably have the head start of age on some of you, which is fine. I mean, it's just a fact. The older you get, the less interested you are in mentioning that. But the Labor Party, in my opinion, folks, the Labor Party was one of the most fascinating and hopeful efforts of the labor movement of the modern era. But for various reasons, its history is unknown, obscure, buried. As I've found out, there's very little that has been written about it. Now, there's a few folks that I understand today, this is already 20 plus years after its dissolution, who are writing about it. I know of one book in the works. I know the author, but I know the subject matter is one of those that kind of inclines itself towards differences of opinion. And I guess I feel particularly strongly about the history of the Labor Party because I was there from before it started and I was there on the last day. And because of my UE position, I occupied a very unique niche because I was the paid political officer for UE. Now, I did 101 other things, bargaining, organizing. Any of you that know UE, it's not that large of a union, nor does the union need to have a political guru. It needs to have somebody to move certain political components of the union. But in any case, when the Labor Party began, when it was incipient, began its slow beginning, very tiny development. UE was aware of it. And because of my job, frankly, it gave me a chance to sort of relate to the Labor Party. So I was very lucky in that regard. And I guess that just means that I have a certain firm belief about how things went because I was there in the front row for the entire thing. I suppose I might not be right about everything, but on an awful lot of things I was. And I could imagine that somebody sitting out on the edge, out in the field, far removed from the party headquarters and the functioning of the party, they would be entitled to have their own dissenting view if it is dissenting. But I just was glad to do this because I think that one of the great unmet needs of our labor movement is to somehow better document what we have. So I will get into it. It's a huge subject, one can imagine. We started a political party that grew and developed within the labor movement or as an adjunct to the labor movement primarily, and lasted 15, 17 years. Several tens of thousands of people came and went through it. At one point, we had over 300 trade union bodies from international and national unions all the way down to sort of very local groups that had officially affiliated with it. Hundreds and hundreds more, maybe several thousand, that were sympathetic to what we were doing. And for proportion's sake, folks may know, I don't know what the exact number is today, but at the time, well, maybe within a decade, the labor movement in the United States used to have something approximating 30,000 local unions out of all the different unions scraped together, 30,000. I would imagine that that has continued to shrink because of plant closings and workplace closings and because of merger together of local, smaller into larger and whatnot. But so the Labor Party was significant, but it never ever represented a giant majority of the labor. I certainly don't want to leave that impression. It was always the militant minority in the left within the unions that brought the support that it had. But to the question of where did it come from? The Labor Party emerged in the late 1980s and the very early 1990s as a largely personal project. Tony Mazzocchi. Tony had been a lot of things in his career. He was in the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, came out of the shop. He worked in a makeup factory in Brooklyn, which was organized, and OCAW as a union had been the product of several mergers. And in any case, it was the CIO Chemical Workers Union. And in any case, Tony Mazzocchi came up in the union as a kind of a freelance leftist, became local president of his local. Then he went on the road to help with organizing projects for that union. Then he became, at a certain point, he was appointed political director, sort of like I was at UE, but Tony became the Washington, D.C. director. That would have been in the 70s. And then into the 80s, Tony was secretary treasurer of that union, elected for 1 or 2 terms. And then he wound down his career in the late 80s, and this notion of a labor party, labor having its own independent party, was one of his lifetime goals. And he had begun to put together Labor Party Advocates. Now, Labor Party Advocates was not a party. All that it was a network of folks who, by the name, wanted to advocate for a labor party. It was an incredibly modest undertaking because Tony, like most of you, would probably already agree and say, well, who would be against the Labor Party? Boy, we sure could use that. I mean, look at what we're stuck with the two-party trap. They don't call it the two-party trap for nothing. And this is not a new problem. This is perennial. And Tony, rather than just decide he was going to start the party or he was going to gather up 5 other people and start the party and expect everybody to come to the mountain, so to speak, he had the foresense to do Labor Party Advocates. Now, what did the Labor Party Advocates do? It was a network, and I'm going to hold this up for those of you that are watching. It produced a little bulletin. This is one of them. This one is from 95, but there were iterations of this going back, I believe, to 1990. Labor Party advocates. This was twice or 6 times a year, and eventually then monthly. It was just a newsletter talking about the agitational and educational work of the Labor Party as a concept. It was this local union had a discussion at its meeting about do we need an independent party of our own. This particular local voted yes, hell yes, we needed this, and we did it. So it becomes it's sort of a small journal, but a very key thing. And the organizational reason that this was selected as the way to proceed is that, as you all might imagine, while there is a wide and deep support for a labor party or a third party out there amongst the population, within the labor movement, almost to the last person, the officialdom deny that this is needed and will crush it and stuff it out and stifle any discussion of this. So it was identified correctly that the first heavy lifting that we had to do in the established unions was to first of all have a discussion about this, to allow to emerge the whole notion that yes, this is a viable question that should be discussed. And then, of course, all of us that were active in that early network of Labor Party advocates, we all believe, yes, of course we need something. The Republicans at that point, and certainly today, they would throw us in jail if they had the capacity to do so. The Democrats, on the other hand, very interested in their money and their votes, but when it comes time to really producing anything, it's sparse, and it's a pretty bad bargain for the amount of money that gets shoveled in. So those of us that helped initiate it, and again, I want to make clear this was primarily led by Tony Mazzocchi, and he had been around a long time, had people all over in different unions and whatnot. He had a great breadth and reach. So this low-level agitation of Labor Party advocates took its place, and it began to create a buzz. Now, remember, everybody, it was before the internet. So creating a buzz before the internet meant that you had to produce a whole hell of a lot of newsletters, and you had to travel, and you had to have conferences, and you had to sort of dream up ways to reach voices and reach folks out there, work the phone. But we did. Now, when Mazzocchi started, he already had in his own union, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers, a pretty wide following of his own. But this had always been something that he talked about, was, what a disaster it was for workers, essentially to have no aggressive representation on the political front. Tony used one of his devices, and I've adopted it because it's eminently true. He used to have a very interesting talk, which I hope somewhere was captured on video, where he talks about the good old days of Richard Nixon. What do I mean by that? Well, for everybody sitting here in the last 50 years, which would include at least the end of Nixon, the high point of labor's successful political action took place under Nixon. Too often or frequently enough with Nixon's support. And to say that and blurt that out is almost unbelievable for people. What do you mean Nixon was a crook? Nixon was a pathological lunatic. He was all those things. But at that time, the labor movement possessed enough influence, and the Democratic Party had enough groupings within it, that labor actually mattered. And people forget, under the Nixon administration, we won in no particular order. We won our pension surety. The ERISA law was passed. The Environmental Protection Agency was passed under Nixon's time. All of the anti-poverty programs were expanded and better funded at the end of Nixon's beginning. He had a national health care program proposed. Can anyone imagine a Republican doing that today? And Ted Kennedy, the dyed-in-the-wool liberal, admitted, I heard him say it, retirement party, that one of his great regrets in his political career was opposing Nixon's program as not good enough. And then, of course, it was shot down, and here we sit today still without a national health care program. So I'm not going to make out Richard Nixon to be anything other than a pathological red baiter and reactionary. But to realize that we made more progress as a labor movement, as working people, on the last couple of years of the Nixon administration. And that's a big if. I mean, other than the war, Vietnam War, I mean, good grief, Watergate. I mean, look, let's not think too well of Richard Nixon. But it was a sad fact that labor since that time has been on a long, steady, slow collapse and decay. And here we are today with Joe Biden, a pathetic figure in the White House, and Labor doesn't even ask for things anymore. As any of you that saw the AFL-CIO leadership endorsement of Biden, it's laughable. It's not a laughing matter to us, to working people, but it's politically laughable. So in any case, and actually Adam had mentioned the website that I write for, Marxism, Leninism Today. If any of you are familiar with that site, go there, or if you're not, Google it up, Marxism, Leninism Today. My article that just got put up yesterday is actually talking about the AFL-CIO endorsement of Biden. And I raised some issues that probably you've never thought of. So go take a look if you're interested in that. So anyway, Mazzocchi used to give that talk, and it always would bring people to their feet, because people would say, yeah, what better proof do we need that we need a better vehicle than this half-assed Democratic setup, and the fact that we trace our decline from the higher point of Nixon. So it was a tongue-in-cheek, somewhat sarcastic presentation, but factually correct, sadly so. So Mazzocchi worked his own personal network, which had limitations. It was when the second union that he was able to work with almost immediately was he came to UE. Any of you are familiar with the role that UE has played over the years and its political orientation. I mean, we took off of it right away. UE had always supported the creation of some kind of independent political action vehicle for workers. So we joined, cast our weight behind the Labor Party advocates. So there you had two national unions that were doing this. And the other thing we did, and I want to point this out, this is something that should not be missed in this conversation. We decided not to set ourselves up on high and say, we need a Labor Party. You need a Labor Party. We asked the members what they thought. What a remarkable, remarkable piece to go to the union members and say, what do you think about this? So we designed a political action questionnaire. I dug it out earlier today out of my own archives. But, so this was a very thoughtful 3-page, wasn't too long, but it also wasn't too short. There was check the boxes and plenty of places to write greater thoughts that you have in there. And we embarked, starting about 1991, we embarked on doing these surveys of membership. Now, the reason we did this, obviously the only place we were able to have this questionnaire utilized in a local meeting or a district council meeting or a national union, the only place that would allow it was where we already had supporters in the leadership who would put it on the agenda and allow it to go. But the leadership almost universally was a little fearful that they were ahead of their members, that they wanted it, but they didn't know where their members stood there. Everyone was always worried about somebody shouting back and resisting it or red baiting you or something. There was amongst the leadership, there was a great strain of that. So by devising the questionnaire, what we essentially did was not only allow the members to actually express how they felt about this question, but when we began to get the results that were rolling in, we saw we got no problem with this. The leadership just beamed, because as we began to do this surveying of the membership, overwhelming majorities, sometimes unanimous majorities of the bodies that were being surveyed came in and said, now I'm only going to read 2 of the questions because I want to give you a sense of what the questions were. Who are you? Tell us who you are, age, gender, and all this. What do you think the 3 top problems facing working people are? There's a whole list that can change. Here's the first one that really was the question. Third, in your opinion, what kind of job is the labor movement doing to promote the interests of working people through political action? In your opinion, what kind of job is the labor movement doing to promote the interests of working people through political action? A very good job, fair job, poor job, very poor job. Very fair question, easy to understand. Another one, page 2, it goes on. It's only 3 pages, maybe 10 questions. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Both the Democratic and Republican parties care more about the interests of big business than they do about the interests of working people. Both the Democrat and Republican parties care more about the interests of big business than they do about the interests of working people. And then there were questions for the true believers in the Democrats. Do you agree or disagree that unions should do all they can to help the Labor Party? So and there's a few other questions which well, I guess the last question we had, number 9. Do you agree or disagree that it's time for labor to build a new political party of working people independent of the two major parties? Now, when we did this, and we made every effort to do a legitimate thing, we didn't try to rig the results. It was, and in some unions, jiggering and riggering is kind of the style of operation by the leadership. But we said to folks, you don't have to fool around. Just allow your members to discuss this. And in some of the unions, that meeting would take place with the trade union style, where they would say, let's have this guy get up and speak for a Labor Party. Let's have this woman get up and speak against the Labor Party. So there was a great effort made to make this a legitimate process so that we could actually get to the end of that road and have an authoritative knowledge of where at least some of our members were at. Well, I'll tell you, that survey was an electrifying event. I think maybe it'll never be mentioned by anybody else who studies the Labor Party, but if they had been there and seen the effect that had, because what began to happen from the first time it was launched, and it didn't matter what the audience was, manufacturing workers, building trades, public sector, service workers, healthcare workers, it did not matter. Almost every question there would come back with in excess of 90% of folks expressing complete or near complete dissatisfaction with the two-party system. Very low ratings, of course, for Republicans. I guess Republicans don't go to union meetings. We might, that may be the case because we know they're out there. The boss hires all of our members, by the way, reminder. But it just was electrifying because it wasn't that the members felt any more excited about it. This was how they felt. This device of using this is what emboldened the leadership to say, hey, I polled my members and they told me that they think the two-party system is for shit. So we need to move forward with this. I guess we didn't necessarily know that this was going to be the case, but this notion that we would ask the rank and file in a fair, reasonable way that was understandable and thoughtfully then tabulate the results. This was electrifying. Exactly how many of those polls were put out, it must have been in the low tens of thousands because we did it for several years in hundreds and hundreds of trade union meetings, everything from conventions at the national level down to shops or, small meetings. I did the surveying in UE. We did about 80 locals. We had 140 locals. We did 80 of them. I don't think we had a single survey that came back that wasn't at least 98% in favor. Now, again, the people who come to the union meetings be the de facto leadership. But this really, it put a great confidence in all of us who were building Labor Party advocates that, this is not our idea, some special left-wing thing that we're partial to because we're smarter. No, this told us that the members were right on with it. I venture to say if we did these studies again today, we would get the same result. Maybe the only difference would be we have some folks that will raise the perceived threat of fascism or Trumpism or something. Okay, fine. That's one of the differences today. Remember also that this entire process was unfolding during the Clinton administration. Now, some of you remember Clinton. Clinton was, if ever there was a fraud and a charlatan and just a loser of epic proportions, Bill Clinton was it. And, essentially governed as a Republican, constantly sought reasons and excuses to make deals with Republicans. I mean, he, like Obama, like Biden, had a majority in Congress of his own party in the first 2 years, wasted it completely. And then for the entire rest of his regime, his staying in office from his own scandals was, by itself an accomplishment. But we suffered enormous losses during the Clinton administration, the trade policy, NAFTA, the decline of manufacturing, rampant union busting, which Clinton never even acknowledged. So this situation where we were we had a Democrat in the White House who had been overwhelmingly endorsed by practically every union. UE didn't, a few others didn't. But then we're out there running this Labor Party advocates questionnaire. And this was an earthquake in certain unions because the leadership, one thing everybody here needs to know, the leaders of these unions, for the most part, think that they know better than their members, if they even care what their members think. And for them to begin to hear these results, wow, this or that union had this survey, and wow, huge majorities of people came to the meeting and said, screw that. And to give you a sense, I'm not going to read all of it, but to give you a sense of some of the unions that we did this, just to give you a sense of the breadth: chemical, oil and chemical, maintenance of way, brotherhood and rail, UE, Building Trades Council in San Francisco, California. This is an early list that grew considerably. Painters Union, Carpenters, Graphic Communications Union, that's printing trades, Teamsters, United Transportation Union, one of the rail brotherhoods, a Central Labor Council, service employees, iron workers, office and professional employees, AFSCME, National Association of Government Employees, NAGE, that's part of SEIU, Coalition of Labor Union Women, CWA, Teamsters, United Steelworkers, National Association of Letter Carriers. We're looking for a few of the new ones. The IUE, the Imitation UE, and on and on. American Postal Workers Union. So when we looked at the breadth and scope of where we were questioning folks and doing this, it was enormous. So we created a bit of wave for ourselves, and we got noticed. I guess at that time, before the internet was really common, labor notes, which still had some issues, but it was one of the ways that our activity got reported, and it got reported in a number of unions. So we moved through the 90s, or through the early 90s, and I guess the first place that I'll express some personal opinion here about this was that by the early 1990s, or maybe 93, 94, when it looked like we had a real head of steam that was building up and a real solid foundation of political support amongst the membership, and then by extension, a lot of the leadership, there became this discussion and clamor about, okay, well, when are we going to start running candidates and actually have a party? And that was probably, a very interesting period of the party, but it was a decade premature, at least a decade premature, because while we had at least tested the waters, it wasn't an organization. We hadn't built anything. It was sort of a public opinion questionnaire and not a party or a pre-party formulation at that point in time. But I will say that push and drumbeat for conversion from Labor Party advocates to the Labor Party, it was very difficult to hold back. And try as those of us might do, it was almost like we had unleashed something with enough people that it was just not going to be stopped. Which I guess you could look at that and be happy about it and say, wow, this was really cool. But it was, by all indications, by any sober observer, this was a premature thing on a lot of fronts. I mean, I guess that's in the eye of the beholder, but this was something that it became clear about late 94, 95 that we were going to have to found a party. And it kept, and I guess the more conversation we had about that, the bigger we eventually grew to where we had, I think, 13 national and international unions that had officially endorsed this. At our peak, I think several tens of thousands of people had taken out memberships in the party. And we've been endorsed by, like I said, more than 300 bodies of the labor movement. So this was significant. Now, for other folks, or for everyone to know, this was also the period of time, 94, 95. This was when Lane Kirkland, the old reactionary head of the AFL-CIO, he was being overthrown by sort of an insurgent group. And while the new group turns out to be in many ways the same as the old, it was in some ways better. And the insurgent group, which was John Sweeney and other folks who then went on to defeat Kirkland, not by much, but they did defeat him in later 1995. These folks actually saw the Labor Party advocates as a useful vehicle, because the old answer used to be by Lane Kirkland that folks in the media once in a while would say, do you think that the labor movement needs a labor party. And honestly, his answer, you can quote me on this, said this before. He said, no, the labor movement doesn't need a labor party. We already had one. It's called COPE. Well, what's COPE? COPE is just a device of the different unions to collect money so they can donate it, mostly to Democrats. So here was the leader of the labor movement just saying, yeah, there's no problem. All we need to do is get more money to give to Democrats and that'll fix the problem. Well, this by its very nature, we ran with that. Say, look, this is the guy that leads the labor movement. He thinks, we're losing tens of thousands of members every month to plant closings and these trade policies and union busting. And this is what this guy's sum total of thinking is on the political question. As big as that, we just need more COPE. We already have one. So anyway, Kirkland was removed, thank goodness. And the movement towards a convention to found the Labor Party had been unleashed. And it happened in June of 1996. And one of the things we did in the conversion from Labor Party advocates, this little newsletter, we converted to a newspaper. So this is the Labor Party Press, and this is the edition that reports on the founding convention in 1996, which was in Cleveland. And I can't say enough good about it. I mean, really, even though it was premature, even though all of us who were in the UE group were very concerned that we were shooting the works here too early, but I guess none of us had a crystal ball. We didn't know when the right time was going to be, but it had about 1,500 elected delegates from hundreds of international, regional, and local unions. And we thrashed out a constitution, debated some of the issues, certainly had quite a unified body. I guess our convention would have been almost as big as what the AFL-CIO convention was last year. The difference being that our meeting was a voluntary meeting where people came mostly on their own dime. The AFL convention would be a paid staff meeting where everybody had their full expenses paid. So I guess politically we could say, we had the momentum. So in any case, we continued to expand through the later 90s and continued to refine the organization. But we ran into something that we didn't foresee, at least as we unleashed. It was 2000. Some of you may remember what the issue was in 2000. We were always in the Labor Party on guard against red baiting and on guard against sort of left-wing baiting and all of this. We could handle all those things. Like I had said, the overwhelming, I don't know that there was a single place that we surveyed people where even close to a majority came out and said, yeah, Democrats are right on. I like it. Wasn't there. Well, the opposition to what we did knew that. And I think they realized that they were not going to stop the Labor Party in any winning of a debate. They were going to have to look for some opportunity to drop the bomb on it or somehow unhinge it. Well, that came along with 2000. Some of you may remember 2000 was the year that Ralph Nader ran for president, and Ralph had joined the Labor Party. An interesting figure. That's when I got to know him, and he's a fascinating guy. He's not right about everything, but Ralph joined. He wasn't looking to utilize the Labor Party as his vehicle, but he came to the party and told us he was going to run. He was so disgusted with Clinton. He also could, he could digest and benefit from all this free research we had done with the members. So Ralph decided to run. Well, it was one of the most wild political times in a positive way for us. I mean, the Gore campaign was one of the most miserable excuses for a political campaign mounted in the modern time. He didn't have anything to say. He had been Clinton's lieutenant all through the 8 years of destruction and decay. And then here he is running against George W. Bush. The best thing that people could say was, well, nobody's going to vote for Bush because he's an ignoramus. Well, we had already learned that lesson in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. People will vote for an ignoramus if they're more disgusted with the other side. So after 8 years of the Democrat, people were completely fed up, or a large number, majority were fed up with this, and they voted for George W. Bush. Well, that became the story of how Ralph Nader was blamed for being the spoiler in that election, and the rest is history. No matter how you slice or dice Nader's impact on that election, there's no credible, sober way for anyone to blame him, even as a spoiler. But this is what the Democratic Party machine landed on, because one thing you can count on, comrades, about the Democratic machine, it doesn't accept responsibility for its own disastrous misleadership, always looking to play the blame game. So we faced a real crisis the minute that this happened. And UE, my union at that time, was one of the two unions that had endorsed Nader, the other being the California Nurses, which was also a Labor Party supporter. So what ended up happening in that period, if those of you that might remember, old enough to remember, there was a period of several months where the election was not decided. And it came down to Florida, the Florida mafia down there, in terms of trying to swing the election for Bush, which they succeeded in, because the Democratic Party essentially gave up as part of a bargain with them. And had it not been for Jesse Jackson going down there and sticking his nose in it, the Democrats would have given up even before New Year's. And as it was, this just further infuriated labor people to see the Democratic Party just be a punching bag for these reactionaries, and just not even to stand up for themselves, and then to have run a miserable campaign. I mean, I remind folks that Al Gore didn't even carry his own home state or Clinton's home state, because they didn't campaign, because they gave up. And it was one of the more miserable, demoralizing moments. But we ended up with the outcome being George W. Bush elected, or somehow forced through with the mania and the misleadership and probably criminal shenanigans down there in Florida. But then that became the story of how the labor movement said Ralph Nader was the one who cost us the election. And he's part of the Labor Party, so we've got to exterminate both of them. And we suffered a backlash for several years that we never recovered from. And it was something that, up to that point, it had been left alone. I had mentioned about some of the AFL leadership tolerating the Labor Party, or even sort of being able to benefit from some of the wave we had started. That ended. And from 2001 on, we were under constant attack. And what that looked like was phone calls made to every union president that was in it, threatening them, telling them either get out of there, stop giving them money, shut it down, keep them out. And increasingly and steadily, we were blocked from any new growth. And we began to lose momentum and lose affiliates that we already had. I venture to say if the AFL and the CIO and some of the affiliate unions that turned on the labor movement, if they had had the good sense to turn that energy into trying to actually elect their man Gore, he may not have lost. But again, this is the paid political industry that the Democratic Party really is. I mean, one thing I would say, mix my own personal in here. Politics in the United States is not political action. It's an industry. It's a corporate entity, or it's an industry with several corporate entities in it. The Republican Corporation, the Democratic Corporation. And, they get paid whether they win or not. They have a whole apparatus and staff and consultants and all these folks. And these were the folks that really came after us. So in my case, it didn't matter, because I worked for UE, and UE's attitude was to say, fuck you. If you didn't like the result of the election, go talk to Al Gore. Don't bullshit me about this. But there were a lot of folks in my positions and in unions that were under the gun, harassed, fired, people that wouldn't knuckle under. So what that begat, as I'd said, was several years of a kind of painful and at times steep decline of our ability to function. The surveying stopped. The debate stopped, the attendance, the membership dwindled, and we lingered into the mid to later 2000s. And I think it was, depending on who you would talk about, 2007, the Labor Party just reached a point. Tony Mazzocchi took sick and passed away. I think it was 2004 during that whole process. And it was kind of this interesting steep climb and then a steep decline connected to that 2000 thing. Now, as I wind down here, and we'll do questions or however you want to do it, You will hear leftists, let me say something about the role of the left in the Labor Party. There would never have been a Labor Party advocates or a Labor Party were it not for leftists, socialists, communists, independent radicals, anarchists, and all the elements that comprise the broad left. Liberals, even. We had our share of traditional folks that were just had reached their limit. But within that was the group that made the Labor Party possible. But throughout the life of the Labor Party, there was always a small minority of ultra-left kooks, frankly, disruptive kooks, lunatics, just an intolerable waste of time that they were interested in splashing around in the Labor Party for their own purposes, did very little work to build the party, wanted to always lecture and whatnot. And one of the best lines that I remember, again, from Tony Mazzocchi, I'll share it with you because you may use it yourself. You'll be in a trade union meeting and some guy or a delegated meeting where somebody comes from a lower body and they're there trying to get the larger body to make a decision or take a position on something. And when Mazzocchi would be confronted with these folks, we would have somebody get up on the floor at the Labor Party. We had several Labor Party conventions and several big conferences. Somebody would say, we need to take a position against abortion. We need to take a position for Palestine. We need to stop the embargo on Cuba. Oh, these are all perfectly reasonable and fair questions, but there's nothing that the trade union movement directly, certainly by itself, can do about that. So Mazzocchi's device to deal with all these folks, who were invariably, these were just ultra-leftists, I guess, trying to be able to say, hey, I got the Labor Party to endorse this or that issue. And then, of course, nothing would happen. So this is some of the game that the left buys into, or some leftists buy into. Anyway, Mazzocchi would always calmly deal with that and say, sister, brother, I appreciate you bringing that matter before the body. That's an important body. But I have one question for you. You're asking us as a national body to take that step of endorsing what you suggest to do. Has your local union done that? Have you done this exact thing? Have you gone to your local union where you come from and have you won the floor and then gotten your group? In other words, are you bringing here your own personal opinion, or are you bringing here the sentiment of your local? Not one time in my history in the Labor Party did we ever have anyone say, yes, I'm coming here because this issue that I'm raising is decided on at our local, and I'm asking you then to take this up. Never once, never once. And I always remember it was one of the most humorous ways to sort of explode these windbags and disruptors that were there. But it was an issue. I don't want to make it sound like it was just a problem. We had great difficulty trying to get everybody to row together, because we did have a small but vociferous minority of lunatics that hung around masquerading as leftists. And where they are today, I don't know, retired. Maybe some of them are college professors. I don't know where they are, but I don't miss any of them, because here we were trying to do serious work with regular workers and not create some perfect device that would suit their standards. It was really that tension was there from the beginning. The other thing I'll address is, and then I'll end, is there's a myth, and I think it's understandable how it developed. But there's a myth that says that the reason why the Labor Party failed was because it didn't run candidates. Well, for someone to say that would indicate that they have absolutely no understanding how political action works in the United States. At the point that we might have decided to run some candidates, we would have to figure out how to fund those candidates. You're not allowed to spend union dues money supporting the candidates. You can only use what they refer to as hard money, which is COPE money or political action monies. It's a completely separate stream of which we had very little access to. So I suppose we might have decided to run candidates, and there would have been 99 cents available to promote their campaign and do this. I mean, that may sound simplistic, but there was no willingness of the pro-electoral faction to realize what that would do. The other thing that I know, I was a trustee. My role in the Labor Party from beginning to end was not only the UE liaison, but I was a trustee. Matters of finance matter, and UE wanted me in there to be in charge. At the point we might have launched the very first, even the only candidate on the federal level, we would have had to comply with all the Federal Election Commission filings and rulings and all this, which our accountants and our Labor Party attorney told us, fine, if you want to do that, that's fine, but you're going to spend $75,000 registering for all these things and filing all the forms and doing this. And those of us that were from the more, I think, reasonable school of things said, no, it's one thing to go from Labor Party advocates to the Labor Party. It's something else to go from the Labor Party to a Labor Party running candidates that in no way were we equipped to support or even select. It was premature. It's absolutely what needs to be done eventually. Sure, none of us denied that. But this notion that somehow that's what caused the failure is preposterous to me. But I can understand how folks have bought into that. So in any case, I'll wrap up by saying that the Labor Party was a fascinating and critical piece of the 1990s, mostly, I guess, the first half of the 2000s. It will remain, for the time being, the high watermark of trade union leadership on these questions, rather than this miserable, like we just experienced with the AFL. There were, if anyone reads my article about the endorsement by the AFL of the Biden reelection, you'll see there's 60 unions represented in the AFL CIO. And then there were probably 50 other people there because they have it rigged so that the people outside from the unions themselves that get a vote on these kinds of questions. But there was a grand total of 1, maybe 2 dissenting voice votes against Biden's unconditional endorsement. So it is painful for me to think that, 30 years ago, we had a significant faction on that executive council that supported the Labor Party and supported independent political action. And it's painful for me to say it's gone. It needs to be rebuilt. Folks like us are going to have to rebuild it. It's not going to happen spontaneously, and it's going to take years to do it. But the result, it's very timely for this discussion, because this is like a labor movement leadership without a pulse, just putting one foot in front of the other at this point. So there's only one way for us to go on this question, which is up. Now, I'm not a believer that at this point in time, the most urgent thing is to start another Labor Party or anything. It would be an interesting thing to question your members. Is never a bad time to actually ask your members what they think. So I'm always for that. But in terms of the moment, for the time being, there is no moment. There are no objective conditions that would give rise to a Labor Party. I mean, you can look at the Labor Party rise and fall that I just detailed, and you could look at that and be, at the same time, you could be exhilarated a little bit that it happened and got as far as it did. But then, of course, it's always to lose, it sucks. And here we are now with, I think we could say that where we started with the Labor Party and where we are today, we're in even worse shape today on the political front as labor and working people than we were when we started the Labor Party. But the objective conditions today for somehow trying to start a Labor Party just do not exist. It would be difficult enough to have the debate, although, like I said, having the debate, as long as it's constructive and based on some member sentiment, could be a positive thing. So it's going to be a while. But I'll wrap up by saying, I appreciate you guys wanting to hear about this. And like I said, the Labor Party, unless you guys know of it, if you feel free to share my email. Maybe I should put it in the comments here. It really is something that is worthy of some study and learning the lessons of it. And I guess not repeating the mistakes that we had, and having an honest dissection of what really did happen is key. And I had mentioned at the beginning of the talk that I know of at least 2 people writing books, and I am chasing both of these people around because I owe it to Mazzocchi and UE and the folks to say, let's make sure that whatever gets written was actually factually correct and not one of these preordained diagnoses. I don't want to find either one of these books and find them saying, oh, the reason why the Labor Party failed is we didn't run candidates. That would be absolutely farcical, to say that. But in any case, I appreciate you guys sitting still for this on a whatever night is it, Tuesday night, and I'll put my email in the comments, and Anybody that wants to get hold of me for this or anything else, please do. And I'll throw it back to Adam. I appreciate you organizing this, and I'll stay for some questions or discussion.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was really insightful. So yeah, anybody who has any questions they want to ask Chris, just type it in the chat and we'll read them off as they come along. I guess one of the first things I would like to ask, sort of based off of one of the last things you said here, was, you know, you had leftists coming into these conventions or meetings and saying like, why don't we endorse support for Palestine or abortion? But I do know the Labor Party endorsed, it had a particular set of issues it was focused on, like universal health care, right? So
Right.
I guess, you know, how was it determined which issue was focused on within the Labor Party?
Yeah, I mean, fair question. And there's a fine line there. I won't tiptoe around that. The basis on which we developed endorsed positions was based on what would be, I think, commonly have been assumed to be basic trade union issues. And yes, we looked to avoid stepping on landmines. I'll tell you an example of this. We had the Farm Labor Organizing Committee was a member of the Labor Party. It's the East Coast Farm Workers Union. It's the only real agricultural workers union. The United Farm Workers is long deformed into God knows what it is, a fundraising device, sadly, a cult from the Chavez family now. But here comes the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. Intense Roman Catholic believers, because most of their members are from south of the border and Roman Catholic believers. This was a make or break issue for them. It was just absolutely made clear to us that if we took a position against or for abortion, that they were going to get up and walk. And to magnify beyond that, everyone would know this is very controversial in a lot of locals. We had made the decision, we need trade union support in rural areas within heavily white and religious groups, and we had them. So yes, the leadership said, we're going to avoid landmine issues, even if those issues, I mean, what was remarkable about it was the folks making the decision not to go there all supported the proposition. Yes, of course, abortion is a real issue. But we had to do this because otherwise, what would have happened? We would have become known in 1998 as the union that, or the Labor Party that split over these kinds of issues, and all of that debate and dissension and whatnot would have been. So that was a very fine line that we had to work. But if you look at the Labor Party program, and I'm not even sure where you might find it online, but if you, I'm just glancing back at the Labor Party press founding convention, it was, you know, the need for labor law reform, make it legal to organize, we need fair trade policies, we need dislocation aid for workers who are getting, you know, their industries are being destroyed, we need to tax the rich. I mean, any of you, yeah, here it is, guarantee a living wage, severance pay for laid off workers, restore the right to organizing, end bigotry, fight racism, universal health care for all, a 32-hour work week, paid family leave and other family-friendly things, quality, affordable public education, stop corporate abuse of our trade policies, end corporate welfare, make the wealthy pay their fair share of taxes, revitalize the public sector, end corporate domination of elections, a just transition movement for the folks being dislocated in Virginia, it would be the coal miners, enforce health and safety for workers, and reclaiming control of technology for workers. Now that's a mouthful to put that together, but you can probably see that there's no union in the country could have really disagreed with any of that. And we had the presence of mind to put together a political program that was widely possible. As you'll see, there's no foreign policy in there. There's none of these hot button issues. I think eventually we would have had to deal with these things. Of course, these are big political issues in the United States. But again, we were looking at ourselves very humbly and saying, do we want to end before we even get started, or do we want to have a chance? And as I had pointed out, the reason we failed was not because of internal dissension. And any of you who've been around the left wing will know that that kills off more left wing projects than you care to admit. We were destroyed by outside repression and pressures put on us. So while I'm not happy about that, at least I can say we didn't set and step in traps of our own making. And that did disappoint some people. There's no question about it. That was not a, you know, I'm providing the leadership view of it, but I think it was arguable. So.
Brian asks, do you think that it would be necessary to first radicalize the leadership of the AFL-CIO to take over control of those COPE funds before starting in earnest with a new Labor Party, or is there some other source of funding that could be found, or do you believe that that level of funding is necessary?
Yeah, let me answer the question by going to the root of the question. The question is, what might be advisable to do today? And then you ask the question of some of the details. Put all of this aside. I'm certain that we have to be honest with ourselves, certainly in Virginia. I mean, good grief, you know, all of you are here in Virginia. We're sort of the arse end of things. I mean, with labor unions, I mean, we are one of the lowest. We're in the bottom 5 of states for union density. The union density, so-called, in Virginia hovers between 4 and 5% on a good day. And therefore, I don't have any problem saying point blank, no objective conditions exist in Virginia today for the development of even a Labor Party advocates. I think when you look at the rest of the country, it's, you know, newsflash, everybody, the labor movement continues to shrink and decay and lose momentum. What I suggest is needed today is not, I mean, there's nothing wrong with having a coffee or a beer and talking about a Labor Party, studying this Labor Party, learning. There's no problem with daydreaming and being hopeful. You know, someday before I cash out, we're going to have a political vehicle of our own. Yeah, we got to keep that alive. But what I have said to everybody, and I'll say to all of you, in Virginia and most of the rest of the country, if not all of it, we need as leftists to pour ourselves into union organizing. We need to reinvigorate these unions, bring into these unions some of the new forces like you that don't subscribe to these old things. Now, I will say, why do I think that's one of the ways to survive? If any of you had been looking over my shoulder 25 years ago, 30 years ago when we were doing this, the predominant Labor Party leaders, or the folks who wanted to give us the floor to do the Labor Party advocates survey, were women and men who had come through the 60s radicalization and somehow ended up in that union, in that factory, in that workplace. And they possessed that left orientation, and they understood the significance of this, but they were busy running a union. But they had the ability to open up the floor for us and get a foot in the door. Now, the problem we have today is, everybody, until your generation gets into the union, that entire generation is retired or dead by now. And time marches on. And I am a big believer that we need the left elements to go into these unions and go into the unorganized workplaces. Anyone that knows me, I'm an inveterate believer that if we're not talking to workers, then we're mostly playing with ourselves. And that doesn't make anybody who wants to play with himself a bad person. It's just not going to build the kind of mass constituency. We don't have the numbers of people within our orbit. And that's a big gig. I can sit here on my ass in Alexandria and say, go into the unions and take them over. But we need folks to take them over. Today, when Adam, you'd asked me about sort of the fellow presenter in this, there's one guy left at the national level, maybe two, that I can think of who were active in the Labor Party. One is the president of the American Postal Workers Union, Mark Dimmenstein, and the president of the Inside Postal Workers Union, a very active Labor Party guy. He's quite a leftist. And probably in National Nurses United, we have a couple of faces. The rest are all retired, gone. I'm even out now, retired. I guess I would have been at ATU until last year. So that whole pipeline has to be refilled with militants and socialists who come in knowing that the trade union, this is something that it cannot forever avoid taking up. And there's no shortcut. It has to be done. I mean, your generation, I'm presuming everybody here's younger than you, needs to get in there and take this apart. So a big gig, but I'm always, my entire career, I've always rejected the whole notion of lighter than air ships. I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. Let's invent a balloon that's so magical it's going to float over all these obstacles that we have and get us where we need to go. We have to confront that. That's an itch that we dare not scratch. We have to say, what's the long march to where we need to go and how do we do it? And in Virginia, it's organizing the trade union. And there are some hopeful signs. That's not what we're talking about tonight, but there are some hopeful signs that union organization in Virginia is not only possible, but would be promoted by folks like us, pushing on these unions and going into these unions. So.
Mark asks, what was the CPUSA's position on the Labor Party?
Oh gosh, I had already left the party by that point. And had I not left the party by that point, I would have left the party at that point, because for probably the first 5 years of Labor Party advocates, the Communist Party was opposed to the Labor Party, didn't aggressively or ambitiously do anything. We were never attacked by them. We were never, it was passive. But the regime that was in power, the Communist Party at that time, was, and it continued through the whole Labor Party list, which is subordinate to the Democratic Liberals, and saw what we were doing was some dangerous adventure. And I think it's a very discredited period of the Communist Party history. I venture to say that today they would probably have a different orientation to it, but that would be an argument amongst them, because there are strong forces in the Communist Party that continue to draw folks to the right. And that's for them to sort out and figure. But yeah, I would say it was comical to me because I knew so many members of the party having been in it. And that was comical because I was able to look at the membership. I blurted out that Ralph Nader had been a member. Yes, I knew that because I had access to the list. Bernie Sanders also joined the Labor Party, and many, many other people. And I would see, on a stream, I would see, people that I knew from the Communist Party that were joining. But in terms of the leadership and their public statements and the articles they would write about it was either they completely ignored it as if it was never happening, or here and there they might mention something that was sort of critical. So I can't complain that they never played any factional game inside the Labor Party. I'll shift and say that the real pains in the ass that we had to deal with ultra leftists in the Labor Party were some, not all, but some of the folks that we would characterize as Trotskyites. And it's like trying to watch something fissioning into, they were just split upon split. They're going through all their machinations, and these groups would pop up, and some of them were very destructive. And one of the jobs that Mazzocchi gave me was to go out and squash some of these things. And you can imagine they would play politics. There would be a city chapter of the Labor Party, a big city like Kansas City or even New York City. There would be a meeting where only 21 people came to the meeting, and then somehow they would pack the meeting. And first thing you know, they're making declarations in the name of the Labor Party. And this was just bullshit, romper room type politics. So we took a hard line to just absolutely push these folks out. And we physically did push some of them out, because while we were very happy to entertain dissent, I mean, remember, the whole Labor Party idea is a dissenting idea in the first place, right? So who the hell were we? But all of you are probably aware, when you see disruption, when you see craziness, when you see that, it has to be stomped out. There's not enough time. We didn't have time, because as you might all imagine, the less political elements in the Labor Party, what I would call more the ordinary worker, they didn't sit through these speeches by these folks. They got up and left. And we weren't going to have that happen. We weren't going to allow these folks. So I guess I don't want to overemphasize that, but I want to say we kept the ultra-left lunatics at bay, because we were not going to allow this thing to be turned into some playground for their therapy. This is not serious political action that most of these other groups put together. It's personal hobby and therapy or disruption or something. So we had to deal with it, and we did.
Yeah, I mean, it would seem like today in our context, that issue would only be amplified, and not just on the basis of, say, like Trotskyists, but like you look at the whole NGO industry right now, right? We're like with identity politics, like it's like every issue has to be addressed, and if you don't address it, you are oppressive and enabling the system, right? So like
Right.
it would almost seem like we would have to deal with more landmines now with these issues than even then.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Well, and I think my counsel today would be exactly the same. Uh, a minimum program of unity, minimum, is the only thing that can unify the largest swath that's needed to get it going. If anybody doesn't understand that, or if somebody insists that somehow their sliver of things it takes precedence, well, then out, there's the door. I mean, this is serious business, friends. Look at the condition of this working class and this labor movement. It's only exponentially deteriorated since the end of the Labor Party. And folks that want to come in and make demands on it and give speeches and just defy reality and everything, I don't see these folks as any friends of ours. There's the door. And if folks want to look at me and say, well, that's not right, you're just, well, I'm sorry. I wish you well in life, but you're not going to build a Labor Party or any left party. You're not. I mean, if I scare people, then you've not ever taken on the boss. How are you going to build an organization to compete seriously for power, local and national power? Taking power of this political power of this country is our goal. If you can't get past these early things, then again, you're just playing with yourself for whatever reason. Maybe I would say the bulk of these folks, maybe they're nice people, but they're not going anywhere. And I guess the trajectory that I've seen over the years is you'll see these folks sort of float in, make their mess and float out. And I'm not interested in having to deal with their mess. I'm not interested to have to deal with their mental health issues. I wish them well on those. You see what I mean? I'm a serious trade unionist. We want to build membership, build power, build so that we have the resources to compete for power and take on this two-party system. And if I'm a little hard-hearted, well, I apologize in advance, but I think we only got as far as we got because we played that card judiciously, but we played it nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like like the early Comintern history, right? Like some of their policies were that they wanted reactionary workers in the trade unions. It was better to have reactionary workers in the trade unions as a basis to them maybe win them over to a more progressive stance rather than canceling them.
Yeah.
And that seems to be like the opposite orientation today, right? Where it's like if you don't have the right approach, you don't know to walk the leftist path in today's context, then you're just immediately shunned and ostracized.
Yeah, and my comment would be, so what? Because this left constituted in that, it's going nowhere. It's a hobby. It's a little sounding board, an echo chamber. And I don't want to impugn anybody. These are nice people. They mean well. It's not a scientifically based approach to building organizational structures so that you can exercise the organizational power. So I don't get stopped. I just sort of go by it and I figure, okay, that's not going to happen. That's not going to. I'll tell a story this way. I remember in the 1980s when I was in the Communist Party, a young guy. I lived in Tampa Bay, Florida, and there was a young guy who was the son of one of the guys that was around the Communist Party and all this. And he was never really interested. The son was never really interested in anything we were doing. Okay, fine. It's not, politics is not genetic, right? So, but I had any number of chances to be acquainted with this young guy. He's about my age, early 20s. And I remember this guy had completely convinced himself that, I'm trying to remember what the lineage of this was. In Chile, before the US sponsored coup that obliterated the left, at least at that period, liquidated it. They had had some philosophers and thinkers and governing part of the Allende regime. They had this whole idea that computer technology was going to democratize everything, and that there was going to be this national, and then maybe this was ahead of its time in some ways, because that's almost true now. There is a computer in most homes today. And he had thought this thing through. It was like this perfect system, and that Chile was going to do this, and everybody was going to vote. And we were going to have complete worker governance of every question. I guess, if somebody was going to swat a fly someplace, they were going to do a quick vote, and the computer would enable the plebiscite to happen so that I remember just kind of thinking, wow, that's kind of interesting. And there was some basis. I knew this, and he was not deluded in having flights of fancy. He knew enough by reading that the Chileans had experimented with this, so I appreciated his scholarship. But I remember thinking to myself, buddy, you ain't going nowhere in this movement. We're not, this is just off. This is the kind of conversation to reserve for drinks and sitting up under the tree. And again, nothing wrong with daydreaming and all this. I would venture to say, if he's still alive, I would say, well, in some ways, your technology has taken root this way, but we're farther than ever from any mass sentiment of the masses being used to do it. So yeah, I always remember that guy, because I thought, what a nice guy, but just unhinged in some ways. Well, I'm here. What's been my career path? I've organized several tens of thousands of workers, and helped to build hundreds at least of leftists and Marxists, and bring them into the movement and all that, maybe more than that. I'm sure this guy paid his taxes and worked hard. Maybe he did well, started a business. I don't know, but he's not a serious player in our movement. So, there is a school of thought in our movement that says, oh, you're not supposed to judge, well, I disagree. I absolutely disagree completely. We need to have a scientific approach based on real results. What works, what doesn't work. We don't have time. At the rate of the decay and the decline of our condition, we don't have time to wait for everybody to figure it out on their own. There's a certain amount of followership that has to be expected. And if folks are unable to do that, well, God bless you. But you're not going to be part of, this movement that we still need to build to confront these monstrous forces that we're up against. Not to demoralize anybody, that's not my mission, but you could take one corporation. Let's think of a corporation. Forget about the big corporations. Let's figure Wabtec. It's the locomotive company that my union is on strike up in Erie, Pennsylvania. Wabtec, 20,000 employees, and as its management, it's forced the UE out on strike. That one corporation probably possesses more resources and more manpower than our entire left put together. I don't like to say that, and I don't like to think that, but it's probably a scientifically provable fact. So you can look at that and become demoralized and say, oh gosh, wow, what a horrible thing. Or you could look at that and say, okay, we don't have any time. We've got to build real organization and truly mass organization based on, again, this minimum program. And your point, Adam, about white workers is in Virginia, fabulous issue. The labor movement in the left goes out of its way to ignore white workers, or even cater to them in the worst cases. But we're the weak link that sinks most labor ships. I don't know about Charles and Brian. I don't know if you're white guys, but if you are, all four of us here are a good example. But how did we turn out this way? How did we turn left and do this? I mean, that needs to be examined. You're right. If we ignore the folks who we are predisposed to not like, you repudiate them at your own peril, because they're not going away, and they will. The people that think that Donald Trump is bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. We see this jackass in Florida. I'll mention one thing for everybody, and you may or may not have even heard of this. DeSantis in Florida jammed through his legislature down there a virtual repeal of the public sector collective bargaining that exists, and creates all these new hurdles. for the union to remain certified. So it's sort of a triggering, a law that triggers decertification if the union, public sector now, local public sector, local and state, if the union cannot maintain 60% dues paying membership year upon year without dues checkoff. So think of this, he bans dues checkoff and then says the union somehow has to figure out a way without dues checkoff to collect dues from at least 60% of its membership. So this has been jammed through. It takes effect on July 1st. The labor movement's going to lose 50 or 60 or 70,000 dues paying members. This is my local that I helped to start in Tampa, Florida is at danger. It hovers around 58, 59%. They're busy like hell trying to recruit so that they're not automatically decertified. Well, that's not even been on the radar of folks. Here we are. And this is DeSantis. This is the lunatic who seems, some days I think he might actually run to the right of Trump and, win the nomination. We'll see. Or worse even than that could develop. I mean, good grief. We all live in Virginia, so we know what bad Republicans look like, so it's a big ticket to chew on, but I think everything that you guys are doing based on what I know about you guys are doing is making the effort. It's good, but I want to wind up on that emphasis. We need to go into the unions that exist and we need to reinvigorate them and we need to start unions where they don't exist. And that's hard, painstaking work with no guarantees. It takes bravery. It takes persistence. I've done it. Any of you can do it. And without that, we're not going to go anywhere. There will be no objective conditions to develop a left vehicle. I mean, we could have a left network, a discussion group, and these kinds of things. Yeah, this is all very helpful. But an actual organization that comes together to compete for power is highly unlikely, absent that trade union base. And I just don't see any way around it.
Yeah, I mean, to get back to this issue of talking about a minimum program, it seemed like the original Labor Party platform was very kind of like outward looking in terms of struggling against, the rich and the corporations with their demands. Would, hypothetically in our context today, would that minimum program need to be looking inward towards the labor movement in terms of the need to reform or transform the labor movement, because it seems like so much of the hindrance for labor to advance is due to the hesitancy or reactionary orientation of the union leadership today. You have millions of dollars of funds the unions are sitting on, but they do not direct it towards organizing campaigns.
Well, yeah, and I had mentioned already as I think a small example, but a good example, Mark Dimmenstein. I'm friends with him. He came up. What did he do? Mark went south as a '60s radical to salt in the textile industry. Dug into the amalgamated clothing and textile workers, played politics and did all these things. Maybe he helped his local function better. Then his plant closed. So what does a radical do when you're concentrating on an industry and the industry is wiped out? Well, he went to work for the post office. And Mark then continued his political agitation to where he first became local president of the APWU local, I think in Raleigh. And then he moved up and became one of the regional elected leaders and eventually became the organizing director and helped that union go out and actually confront the non-union private competition that's helping to destroy the post office. And then he used that as the stepping board to become president of the union. Now, is he doing everything that I think he could do to sort of change his union and all this? Well, I really don't know because I'm not looking over his shoulder. I venture to say that probably yes, I would push him harder to make real structural changes in the union. But I do know that under Mark's leadership, two significant things have happened. He, for the first time ever, you might have seen this in the news a couple of years ago, he brought together a bargaining coalition of the 4 postal unions, which had never happened before, having 4 different unions all flailing away in their own interest. Mark actually drove the the notion that we're going to have a bargaining coalition here, remarkable. Certainly hasn't happened in a lot of other industries where it needs to happen. I think rail is one of the best examples to have, 15 different unions all doing their own thing. It's ridiculous. But the union leaderships of those individual unions love it that way because it gives them maximum wiggle room. But Mark was able to accomplish that. And then I had already mentioned Mark actually spends some of the union resources on trying to organize the unorganized non-union competitor companies that are single-handedly destroying the post office. All right, neither one of those things maybe are all that remarkable, folks, but without Mark Dimmonstein, neither one of those things would have even been on the discussion agenda, let alone things that he was able to jam through as initiatives for the union. So he's made a real remarkable change, huge amount of change yet to come. But he's old enough. He's older than me, right? He's 10 years older than me, so he could retire and kick back. He stays at his post, and I don't know where it's going, and I don't know who's going to succeed him. But he's played a constructive role, So with one example, that's the best we can do.
Yeah, I mean, Foster back in the day, one of the big drives in the 20s, 30s, they were pushing for amalgamation of unions, right? And I can just see, even in our state, one example, there was the Advance 6 strike recently in Hopewell, Virginia. They have 2 sites in that area by the same company, but they have 2 different contracts that expire at 2 different times with several different unions involved in that. So, it's just like, why are the unions not making sure the contracts are being negotiated at the same time, that there is greater coordination?
Precisely.
And that strike they went on was just totally defeated. And the workers would say, we got an even worse deal than
Well, I should say I never wrote this out, but maybe for the small group here to benefit from. The chemical workers at that strike are affiliated with the UFCW. They're affiliated with the grocery. Now, I had mentioned Tony Mazzocchi coming out of the Oil Chemical and Atomic. Tony's union was the CIO union, the one that they're in, the workers in Hopewell that went into UFCW. It's an AFL union, or formerly was an AFL union. It couldn't be a more dramatic difference between them. And everybody's right. William Z. Foster put together his kind of push for amalgamation. The difference was Foster was pushing for amalgamation and merging together of unions based on a program to move the whole thing forward. The merger that led to that chemical workers, it was the Akron, Ohio, it was the International Chemical Workers Union. What led that merger was the leadership that owned the union ran out of gas and decided to sell it to the UFCW so they could bail out and enjoy. And then those poor workers in that union are now stuck in this absolutely moribund grocery workers union. I mean, it's laughable. Not laughable to them because you guys that were close to that strike saw this. Now, I venture to say that little history that I just reported, none of the members know that. And if any of you keep up with any of those workers and they want somebody like me to have a Zoom with them and tell them what their own history is and how they ended up in this ass end situation, I would do it. It's still going to be a big piece of work to overthrow the regime that controls that union, or at least first confront it. But I mean, it really is I guess it comes back. Think about this. Part of the reason why you guys that are familiar with that strike are pain, you have heart pains because of it, is you saw the potential there. And rather than the union utilizing the potential, no, the union got in the way and fucked things up and undermined it. I mean, and we had enough problem dealing with the boss without having people in our own organization do it. But as you might imagine, I don't know anybody who works there. I don't want to act like I do. Any of you familiar with probably know that these are workers just drifting along in space and time, and the union does absolutely nothing to teach and lead and educate. It's our job to do that. If those workers are ever going to come together, if any faction of those workers is going to come together to confront this leadership in the union, it's going to have to be folks like us. I would suggest anybody who lives down there, apply for a job. It's not a bad job by today's standards. But get in there. I mean, I heard, what was this? A few months ago, I heard from a young brother in the IU, the old right wing of UE down in Roanoke, who works in a factory, and I can't remember the name of the factory, but It's been organized in the IUE for decades. He got hold of it. This young guy is going to overthrow the regime. I mean, he's got a regime that wants to kiss the company's ass and kind of play along and, keep everything quiet. And this young guy comes along and he says, hell no, we want to do it. So I became sort of his private campaign advisor, but I think he has the makings of somebody that could. Now, he's one guy, and this was one of the discussions I had. I said, you can't overthrow this thing one guy at a time. You got to build a group of people here that understand that they want a more aggressive, relevant trade union program. So he's busy down there working on it. I'm rooting for him. But, that's what's required. No way around it. I told him, you're not going to, again, that lighter than air ship that you read about in science fiction, it don't exist. You're going to have to walk up that hill under your own steam. And by the way, does Adam, you or anybody else know anybody in that local down there or keep up with anybody after the strike?
The one in Hopewell?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we got some workers submitting to us their kind of notes, reflections on it, and they seem to have this idea that, it's like, well, the company really was fucking us over, and it just sort of seemed like this idea like, oh, the union couldn't really do that much. But it didn't seem like there was a deeper critical understanding of like the role of the union and helping create that situation where they were that powerless, because again, like they have two different windows when the contracts are negotiated between the Advent 6 South plant and the Advent 6 North plant. And it's like, well, why wouldn't you have them simultaneously up for negotiation?
Well, I know that I don't know the answer to this, but I'm going to blurt this out because I'm certain that this is the answer, which is it's a weak union. It's an old AFL union. So then once they went into the grocery store union, that sure as hell didn't make any sense. So at some point in time in the history of their bargaining, the employer jammed this through at point of gun, and they got stuck with it. Maybe they didn't even bother to resist it. Who knows? And then forever, what this means is the weak link always goes first. And this is just basic 101 employer labor relations. The reason why I mentioned it is, and I have enough to do without drumming up business, so to speak. But if you thought that getting 2, 3, 4 of these guys on the phone for me to visit with them, I'm certain I could give them some productive counsel. I would share with them. I would mail them some books and do some things. I mean, much worse trade union situations have been cleaned up and changed. But somebody, and that's why I'm making the offer, somebody has to reach in there and say, hey, sit still, listen. Let's talk about this. What's the next thing? Just like this brother over in Roanoke. He had the presence of mind. I can't remember how he found me. It might have been through the Virginia Worker. I don't know. Somehow he found out, or one of the Zooms I gave on Williams Foster. And I don't expect that he's going to do everything that I suggest he do. And I don't believe that he's going to avoid doing the things that I counsel him not to. But the fact was, we have a little friendship. And I think he has an understanding. I know what I'm dealing with, and I've showed him some support. And I'll continue to do that as long as he continues to, kind of do that work. I have already assessed. I told him, I said, he's got an interesting situation where he's got about 400 people in his shop and about 375 that are in the union, and the leadership is all ready to retire. So he truly is positioning himself to become the new generation of leadership. There's sort of a demographic turnover going on. And I'm rooting for him. I mean, this guy's alive. How much of a leftist he is, certainly some, but consider what he's up against and what he's had. I mean, so I would gladly do that. And if UFCW called me the bitch, I would just hang up. But if these guys wanted somebody to at least talk to and bounce things off of or anything, I'd be happy to do it. Happy to do it. But I would
reach out. I know there was like 4 different unions, I think, involved in that because they have several different union representatives. Just
which I'm going to blurt this out. Indulge in the eruption. What they need is a bargaining council. It's as simple as that. You have 4 unions, 2 companies, or 1 company, 4 unions, 2 locations. It's as simple as them getting together and saying, okay, folks, either we hang separately or we hang together. And that is something that the unions are never going to do. They're going to avoid doing. And that may end up being the conversation we have with them. is a quite common situation in the United States, folks, where since no union jurisdiction is ever respected anymore, every union, almost every union, goes out and organizes anybody they can grab to get the dues and keep things going. And then it leads to the situation where you have multiple unions involved. I mean, I had this every part of my career, even UE, we would organize something in some company and we would find there's 6 other unions. Well, if you don't contact those unions and build a little network, kind of a common council, you can beat your head against the wall for the rest of your life at that one location. You're not going to arm wrestle the company to the ground one union at a time. So I've done that many, many times, and it needs to be done. And it should be a common practice amongst the unions. But like I said, the union staff and the local leaders, they just want to just, get the contract done, move on. It's a business union. It's not a movement. So yeah, I wouldn't turn down a chance to talk to them if it said they don't know me from Adam, but I think I could only imagine. It's already clear. You talk to these guys. I know more about their situation than they do. It's tragic. But so
yeah, it's depressing because it's they have unions, but then they have to work 18-hour days, right? Like the point of a union should be providing an improvement in the material conditions, right? And 18-hour days. I mean,
and
these
old
folks are having to
timer,
sleep in their cars between shifts because
yeah,
they can't even drive home.
an old timer in the union said to me one time, 35 years ago, he said, "Kiddo," he used to smoke a pipe and suck on his pipe. He says, "Kiddo, let me tell you, says, you don't need to join the union to get what the boss was going to give you anyway." And I thought about that, and I thought, God almighty, that's absolutely true. How many people are stuck in unions that's what the union does? It just accepts what the company gives to them. Maybe it orchestrates a little hocus pocus to make it look like it was bargained, but then they just pass it on and then they run. And I'm thinking, it shouldn't be for a union member today in Virginia or anywhere else. It shouldn't be, nor can it be, a choice between better than nothing or no union. Because if any of you have ever argued with any of these business unions and really gone after them, sooner or later, whoever you're arguing with is going to say, what the hell are you complaining about? It's better than nothing. What a low grade to compare yourself to nothing. To be willing to just say, oh, yeah, fuck it. Yeah. Well, if I get you 1 degree of heat, that's better than none. Yeah. It's better to be at 33 degrees than 32 degrees. You know what I mean? But this is the low tone of too many of our unions. I mean, yes, there are exceptions, but I think it's folks like us that have to go into these organizations and reinvigorate them. And it is possible. I mean, there's I don't know anybody here except for you, Adam, but I mean, a great number of unionized employers are hiring today because of the demographic turnover, and getting into some of these things is very, very possible. I did a Zoom a couple of weeks ago with left-wingers who were all thinking about going to work in the railroad industry. And I think some of them were obviously not equipped to deal with it. They just wanted to know more. But there were some serious students there that were saying, yeah, I'm an electrician already. I don't want to be a gypsy following job sites. I don't want to go to work for the power company. Maybe I can fix the signals on the railroad and join the railroad signalman. And the signalman will hire you on the spot, for God's sakes, or the companies will. So I think that's because, everybody here probably was aware of it. I followed the railroad strike. One can imagine what's going to happen. The left leadership of several of those unions that nearly was able to lead that national strike before Biden so disgustingly crushed it. Many of them are going to quit and retire because they're kind of at the end of their careers. They give it their best shot. They're going to go. So we're kidding ourselves if we don't say, hey, we've got to filter some people into the rail brotherhoods to start them along the way in the pipeline. And otherwise, we're going to find these unions, Railroad Workers United is really the left vehicle in that industry. We're going to find them just sort of petering down as they lose the old cadre. And once you retire, as I find out, you're away. It only takes a few weeks and you're out of the game and you're not a player anymore. And you can help as a retiree, but you're really not in that daily contact with the membership. So yeah, the railroad industry, not that I wanted this to be a commercial for going to work for the railroad, but all over Virginia, they're dying for, applicants to consider. So for everybody, think about it. Adam, one thing, I put my email up, but did it go to everybody, or I can't tell? Or maybe you send it around.
Yeah,
Feel free.
here, I'll
Just
copy and
mentioned it.
paste it into the
Yeah, just
chat
for
here.
everybody to have it.
Yeah. So, it sounds, you're making the comment that a lot of the leadership of these unions back in the day with the Labor Party were coming out of the high mark of the 60s and 70s, where the strike waves were way bigger than they are now. But a lot of these folks, as you mentioned, are aging out, retiring, or gone. I guess the question is like, if there was some sort of an effort at trying to even just do a Labor Party advocates, not even, I think we'd all agree it's premature to say we're launching a Labor Party, right? But just, trying to agitate that question of the need for a class party, would it be better to try to sidestep, the labor bureaucrats these days rather than trying to go through them to get to the rank and file for something like this?
Well, think about what I was talking about with the questionnaire device. I could send you a copy of this. I don't have an electronic copy, but if there was a local union someplace, remember, we're talking only about the organized 3 or 4%. Unorganized workers don't have any way to meet and consider these questions. So by default, we must be limited to only the trade union forces. But let's say that you find out in your network you've got somebody in a local union someplace in Virginia, and they have a meeting and they might be able to get the floor. I mean, maybe crafting a Virginia specific version of that questionnaire. I think that would be in order no matter what was going on, because wouldn't you think that the labor leadership, even of that local, would be interested in knowing what their members really think? How many of their members are Republicans? How many of them voted for Trump? I mean, these are really scary questions, but they get scarier if you never try to answer them. And, in Virginia, we're all accustomed to the Democratic Party coming out of hibernation, making claims. They do a little better rhetorical job recently. And then they get elected. And, even though we can recognize in the last few years, they unbanned collective bargaining and took a run at repealing right to work. These are significant things. But by and large, the state is going down the drain as far as workers go. And the party is just not clued into this. It's a middle class organization, and the AFL-CIO, under the leadership of Doris Krause-Mays, thinks they're great. Actually, maybe I should telegraph something for everybody. She came out a few months ago, you might remember. Somewhere I saw this online, and she decried some legislation that Youngkin, the gov, was pushing to eliminate labor education in school. I see your head nodding. So I have to do this. She doesn't know me. She's met me, but she doesn't know. I need to see if I can get an answer from her, which is, what's the state AFL-CIO doing to educate workers about unions? Before we bitch about the governor and the state schools, and what's the head of the AFL doing? Well, punchline, everybody, she ain't doing shit to educate anybody. Her job is to corral dollars and votes for Democrats. That's what her position is. But I need to do that, because then I can write an article. I'll write it for you guys in the Worker and just say, before the labor leader of the state starts bitching about what the state is doing, maybe it ought to look in their own bailiwick and say, what are we doing? And I think what I've daydreamed about this, I think I'm going to mail to her a copy of a book, Labor's Untold Story, which any of you that know me, I'm always waving that book around. It's just a very general history of Labor's Untold Story. She's never seen it before. I doubt it. I can't believe she ever has. And she wants to do something about educating. Doris, you ought to buy a whole truckload of these things and put them in your car, and everywhere you go doing your AFL-CIO business, you could pass them out to people. She wouldn't even have to buy them herself. The state AFL has enough money. They could buy her a trunk full of these things. Then I would say, okay, we've got a leader that's actually out there trying to educate people from nothing to something. But to stand up there and piss and moan about this governor, what did anyone think this governor was going to do? And then, is this the biggest issue that we face? Why do we rely on the public schools? I don't think it can be controlled anyway. I think young kids in school are going to find out about labor whether or not the state teaches it or not, because it comes up. So I don't know. It's another one of these phony postures that somebody strikes because they want to look like they're pro-union. And trust me, everybody, the next time she goes to an AFL-CIO state convention, they'll celebrate her as this great labor leader who actually went after Governor Youngkin because he was going to eliminate trade union education in the schools. I mean, please, so they almost cries out for me to confront her on this. So I guess take that in the form of a promise. You'll be getting a draft article from me.
That'd be great.
Yeah,
I mean, they don't do anything. I mean, when we did our first strike action at Target, that was one of the things. I did an interview with this labor radio program. They asked, like, well, what can the labor unions do today? And I was like, well, a mass education campaign would go a long way, because we were never taught anything about the National Labor Relations Act. Most folks don't even know that exists, as shitty as it is. There's no curriculum dedicated to labor unions, and at least in my public school when I went through.
I've never seen one.
There's
Maybe
been nothing.
But never a high school. No.
So it's like, what sort of attack on labor history is happening when there was no actual labor history taught in the first place? I would imagine most folks or youth being introduced to the idea of unions is probably coming through something like Starbucks or Amazon, whatever media attention that
something they find online. Yeah. Well, before it gets any later, I see Charles and Brian still there. If any of the three of you want a copy of Labor's Untold Story, did I ever send you one, Adam? Have I ever sent you a copy of Labor's Untold Story?
Yeah, you did, and I lent it out actually to someone else. So,
well, I'll send you another one if you want. That's what happens. You end up. But any of you want to send, Adam, send me your address again. I know it had it someplace, but just text it to me or something. Any of you that want to email me your U.S. mail address, I need a U.S. mail address because I'll send it to you book rate. It saves me some money, but it'd be my gift to all of you here in Virginia. I think it's a good thing. So, happy to do it. I hold the personal record for circulating that book. It's produced by UV. It wasn't written by them, but it's produced by them. For whatever reason, if you're not familiar with it, Labor's Untold Story is a history of the labor movement in the United States that goes from the colonial period up until 1955 when it was written. And even though it was not my favorite book, I liked it. I first got it when I lived in Florida 40 years ago. But I will say that amongst the average worker and just the preponderance of faces that I deal with, it seems to be the book that more than all the rest put together catches people. And I can't tell you how, not a week goes by that I don't hear from somebody who says, hey, you sold me that book in 1985 and wow, can I get another one? The common thing is what you just said. Hey, I used to have it and I gave it away, or loaned it to somebody. So I'd be glad to refill your shelf there. But it has that effect. And actually, one of my retirement projects is to try to, and I mean, seriously do this. We got to find somebody to write some of the update of the last 60, 70 years. And then we can relaunch it at the next printing with sort of that update. It's going to be a hard book to, scrupulously document it like two authors of it did. But we can do something, to update, the condition of things and then have it relaunched. So that's one of my many, many projects. But yeah, any of them, just iterate again. My email was in there. If any of you want a copy of Labor's Untold Story, the book, I will gladly mail it to you. But you do got to send me your name and your whatever name you take your mail under, and your U.S. mail address or post office box or something. Then I'll give me a week or two. I'll put them in the mail. And I think I got my email ready there. Yes, CW Townsend52 Gmail. Yeah.
Got it copied in. Well, it's we're getting close almost to the 2-hour mark here. I don't want to keep it going. I'm sure.
Yeah.
We all got something to do here. Appreciate your time and the presentation and answering the questions. Been super helpful. We'll call it to a close unless anybody has any final questions here. If you do and you didn't get it asked or answered, be sure to send Chris an email with this email address there. Folks are saying thanks for presenting here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And Adam, you know me, I may not always agree with folks, but I always make an effort to support left the hand, you know. And Adam, I think you said you're recording it, which is fine. This probably will end up being one of the very few videos that anybody has done about the history of the Labor Party. Where are you going to post it? You said you're going to put it on.
This will be on our YouTube channel, The Virginia Worker. I can send you a link once we got it uploaded.
Please do, because I will send it around. In the next day or two, I'm going to send around a link to whatever my list is. It's probably 500 people all around the country and the world, but I bet 50 of them are here in Virginia. So I'm going to send out the link to the article I just did about the AFL-CIO endorsement of Biden. That's on Marxism, Leninism Today. I can send that out. And then I'll attach this link also. Say, look, if anybody's interested in the Labor Party, you know, because I've done that before with the Worker. You know, you guys do good work. I like to pump it up a little bit.
Great.
And there's very little Virginia centric, you know, and you guys are filling that niche, so I appreciate it. And it's about time. So yeah, I'm happy to be here.